Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Art After Hours. I'm Shauna Robeson with Creating Space Coastal, and in this video, I'm going to be continuing our inky journey with some additional tips, tools, and techniques that you can try to maximize the use of your stamping, stenciling, and inking tools. We're going to be doing some watercolor techniques. We're going to be doing some interesting chemical techniques, and just seeing ways that we can, like I said, maximize what one stamp can do or what your inks can do. So if you want to find out how to do some of these fun techniques, please stay tuned and let's get going. Welcome everybody to another night of ink, stamps, and stencils. We're continuing our journey tonight by focusing on some detail stamps. Last time we did background stamps, which are a little bit more loose, a little more random, a little bit just, easy to do these backgrounds. And I'll show you what I did with some of the backgrounds that I made last time. But this week, we're going to be talking more about precision and other techniques that you can do with stamps. And I mentioned this earlier, but of course it was off camera. So I did want to just share that this is how I started my creative journey, was with stamps and inks and stencils, and over 25 years ago. And it's a great gateway to art, because maybe you don't have the skill yet of drawing and things like that, but you can do the coloring or just figuring out the aesthetics of design elements. So it's a great way to sort of step into creating before you've maybe developed all the hand-eye or muscle memory coordination of drawing and things like that. It's not quite as limiting as some other techniques might be out there. So this is really where I started my journey. I was in scrapbooking and then card making, and then that developed into watercolor. And then I just dabbled from there to acrylics, and then it just became a whole mixed media madness of creating. And I loved every minute of it. So, but this is where I began. So I was realizing that the other day. Now, these are some of the cards that I created with what we made last time, the background stamps. So this was a stencil that I did, and I used some dimensional foam adhesive tape under there to lift that. I did some stamping with pigment ink on this matting, and I added a little bit of some embroidery thread just to give a little bit of some interesting dimensional elements. Okay, so this is a little bit of an echo technique, which I'll be demonstrating. If you can see the hello has a little bit of an echo effect or a shadow effect. So I'll show that. This I just stamped, and then I fussy cut it out. So that was a stamp I colored, and then I took some strips of paper just to create almost like a ribbon effect to divide up my backgrounds paper to the other side. It's just a very simple design. This one, I did the same thing. I fussy cut out that stamped image. I added a little sparkle, which is hard to pick up on the camera. And then I added a little bit of some pearl elements, which was just this little liquid pearls that I just put on there for some embellishments. This one, I just used some fun corner punches to add some elements, and just matted. These were two background stamp pages that I used together, and I just brushed on the ink there. And this one, I cut the background piece in half diagonally to make some corner elements, and then I just stamped in between, added some sequins. So there's lots of ways you can finish off your cards. This one, I split a background page this way, and then I just stuck the two halves above and below this other background stamp that page that I made. And then I added some fiber element that I had in my collection. And then this was just some basic stamping. So as you can see, you can come up with those simple background designs. You can create a whole bunch of different card designs. Or like I said, you can always add these to your mixed media or art journaling project for even more fun effects. Now, what I'd like to do is back up just a little bit And because we're going to be talking a little bit about precision, like I said, and I did mention this tool once before, and you can, of course, always eyeball things. Okay, you don't have to have any fancy tools. For years, I didn't have things, and then I just added them as I found, as they came along, and as I found that they're helpful. And this is one of those. So when you're trying to figure out exactly where you want to stamp, and you want to make sure that you're precise with it, using a stamp positioner tool is very helpful. This one is called the Misty, and it's very popular. And I just actually discovered that, I thought that was a newer model, but there's actually metal underneath the bottom of this plate. So with magnets, I can actually hold down my projects. And so I just discovered that, and I have these magnets in my, just in my collection somewhere for something else. They did not come with it. But but it does have that option to hold down your work. And then it also has this foam pad, which I've talked about recommending to use as a platform to stamp on to get better detail. So how this works is, let's say, for example, I'm using clear stamp, and let's say that I want to put a clear stamp exactly in a certain spot. So I have this little fishy guy, and let's say I really want him to be talking on this this little speech bubble. And I want it positioned exactly where I want it positioned, right? I want to know exactly where it's going to position. Now I could, because it's clear, I could simply put this on my clear block, and I could eyeball it and put it where I want, right? And that's great. I can certainly do that. But the problem is that if I stamp it and it doesn't work out well, trying to line it up and re-stamp it is a challenge. So what this allows me to do is not only line everything up, and I can also actually make a collage of things. Maybe I want to put also a sentiment, or maybe I want to do more things at one time. I could do that with this, which I couldn't with the block because the block's smaller. So basically this door closes on top of the stamp. The stamp then sticks to it. This acts like the acrylic block that's going to be doing the stamping. And now I can ink it up. Let me back this up a little bit so you can see. I could ink this up. And it doesn't matter for this demonstration what I use, but I'm going to just use some. And I make sure that this is in that corner, so I know that position hasn't moved. And in fact, I can use the magnets to do that. I'm loading up my stamp. You'll notice I'm just tapping, and you can sometimes twist and tap, and I'm just getting my stamp loaded. Now I'm using a pigment ink because pigment inks tend to work better with these clear stamps, but I'll tell you a way that you can make them work better with your dye-based as well. Now, of course, I got to move that magnet out of the way. I did not stamp this one yet, but so now I can just drop the lid down. It's hinged. It's going to go exactly where I wanted it, and lift. Now, if I decided I didn't like how that stamped, maybe it didn't cover it completely, because sometimes, especially if I was using a dye-based, water-based ink, it's not going to stick as well. So I might want to stamp it again. All I'd have to do is reload and stamp it again, and I would get it exactly where it was, because I have this held in spot and I know exactly where that is. Now, another way I can use this is like that shadow, the echo that I showed earlier. I'm moving the paper just slightly. I'm not going to re-ink that because I want it to be a little bit lighter. I want an echo of this stamp, just a slightly offset. So I just moved this slightly, and I'm going to set it back down. Press. And now I have a little bit of a shadow effect. See how it gives me a little bit of a three-dimensional shadow effect there? So that's why this tool is particularly used to just line up your elements. Let's say you want to place this exactly in the corner on top of this card. It's a stamped element. You can line up the corner and then just push that into the corner, and you get it lined up perfectly with that corner. And if it hangs over here, you can just trim it off. So it's very helpful for getting precision with your stamps. Maybe you want your sentiment exactly positioned. Now let's say I want my words to be in that bubble, right? So I can bring this back over here. I can set my words right inside that bubble. And now, as long as this is in the corner, and to make sure it doesn't move, I can add that magnet. And then I set that down. It picks up the stamp for me. And now I can load it up. Now these don't have anything to do. This card doesn't really like make any sense. Well, you know, I could try to make something out of it, but it's a little all over the place. But now when I go to stamp, it should be right in my bubble exactly where I want it. Ta-da! And then if I say, you know, that didn't really, it's very light on the camera. Let me do a darker color so you guys can see. Let's say I don't like that color and I want to do it a different color, or I want it to be black, or I want to do a shadow effect. Now I can go in and redo it, and I know that it's going to go right back where it started. And it's just covering right over that green that I didn't like. So it's a great tool. It's very helpful. Like I said, you could try eyeballing it, and you know, you probably would be successful, but it's just a little shortcut. And I find it very handy for a lot of different techniques that I'm doing. All right. Now, let's say I want to do the same kind of thing, except for I don't have a clear stamp, because that doesn't really work with the block stamps, right? Because you can't stick the wooden stamps into that the MISTI. So if I do want to use a wood stamp, okay, let's say I want to make some bubbles to go up, and I want to know where they are going to. And with wood stamps, you can't see what's under it. This may be right exactly as it's aligned, but basically this is glued on, and then this is a sticker that's stuck on, and these may not at all be aligned. I mean, they should be at least going the same orientation, but this could be up here, and this could be down here. So it's generally what it is, but it's really hard to place. And that was there's this, it's called Stampama Jig. That's what I used to use back in the day. And I don't know what happened to mine. So I've actually come up with a DIY, and you might be able to do that too. If you have something like what I have, but they do sell things that are like that for like $7 on Amazon. So I created my own Stampama Jig, basically. And it's just an L shape, or it's really a little guide with kind of a small L. And then it has a piece of acetate or some kind of film. And what you do is, I'm just using 2 acrylic blocks because I know that they are going to create a perfect right angle, and I need a little depth. You'll understand why in a minute. I'm going to move this out of the way. I don't need that yet. And then I have this plexiglass square that I use for my watercolor, and I'm sticking that in there. So let's say I want to create these bubbles and I want to know exactly where they're going. So what I can do is I can take this stamp. Now I'm using this archival ink. Now this is actually, turns out I did a little more research, and I read this wrong. For some reason I thought it said water-based, but it says use with other water-based. But it's actually an oil-based, and it's permanent. So it's going to be a little bit stickier. So it's going to stick better on non-porous surfaces whereas the water-based, those are going to bead up and not stick as well. So I decided to use this. I can also get it off of it, so it's not a problem. So I'm just going to load my stamp. And how I load my stamp is I just tap, my twist, tap. I don't want to do rocking and rolling. I've told you guys that before because I don't want ink on the sides here, because then I could potentially put that on my project and I don't want to. So you want to go straight down, maybe twist, and then finally tap, and then look and see if your stamp is loaded. Okay, then I'm going to make sure that these are all aligned. This is pushed up in the corner, and then I'm going to do the orientation that I want. I want the bubbles to kind of go upwards, I think, or yeah, I want them to go upwards. So I'm just going to line this block in this corner, in the corner, the right angle between these two blocks, and stamp. And it doesn't matter how beautiful this is. I'm just doing a guideline. Okay, so that's the orientation of how it's going to stamp. And now I can put my piece of paper. I can just take the clear that I stamped on and I can put it how I want the bubbles to go. So let's say I want the bubbles to go just like that. All I have to do is bring back my right angle. I want to make sure this is secure. Okay, now I've got my bubbles in the right angle. I have the paper underneath so I can see where it's going. Now I can move this out of the way. I take my stamp, I load it up with whatever I want. And I want to make sure that I orient this the correct way. So I want to look at the stamp, how I stamped it. If I rotated it upside down, it wouldn't work, right? So I just want to make sure. I'm going to double check. So that looks good. And now if I go right into that corner, it should put those dots right where I wanted it to go. And voila, I have my bubbles right where I wanted to go. So that's basically how the stamp positioner, like I said, there's two different versions. There's one that's sold, it's like $7, and it's just an L-shaped acrylic block. And then it has a sheet of acrylic, flat acrylic, just like this, and on Amazon. So if you are interested in doing it, it is very helpful. You can also use it with the clear stamp. So if you don't want to get that other, you can also put your acrylics on your block and do the same thing. Just line it up in that corner wherever you want it to be. So you can still use it with the clear stamps as well. It's just there's more things you can do with the Misty and the clear stamps than you can do with this. So that is just some tools that are available that might just help give you some shortcuts in your stamping adventures. Now this, because it is oil-based, it does require a little bit extra work to clean up. It could stay there because it's permanent. If I just tried to wipe it off with water, oh, it actually came off pretty good. There's a little bit of remnants of it there. So all I'm going to do is take a little bit of alcohol, and that should take the rest of that off. Yeah. So let's say I have this really cool heart collection, and I like this design here, right? But I only have one. And let's say I want 3 hearts, but I really like this design. So I don't have 3 of those in here, but I can create 3 of those. This is a solid, see, it's kind of a solid shadow stamp. So I'm going to use that. So let's say I just have this heart stencil also. I don't even have another stamp. So let me just show you a way that I can basically make 3 of these hearts like this with only one that's actually like that. I have to block off all of these other patterns because I want to make sure that I'm only going to be getting ink in this one heart area. And since I'm using this stamp, that's the size I'm basically trying to protect. And I'm going to ink it up. Now I only need to really ink it in the middle. So if I had a small cube, it would, I wouldn't have to necessarily load the whole thing up, because I just need to have enough of it. And this might actually help to have the foam underneath, so I get it to press a little bit better, because I have to go through the thickness of that stencil. So I'm going to lay that down just to see if that helps a little bit. And then I'm going to push that in there. Now I could use my Misty for this as well. And then that would help if it didn't come out so good, I could reposition and get it in there better. Okay, so now I have a smaller heart with that design, using a stencil with the stamp. So you're basically using the stencil as a mask and then stamping through the stencil. And I used that same technique to create this, for example. I did a stamp through a stencil because I didn't want these wings to extend beyond my stencil shape. And then I also used that here. This was a stamp, these radiating lines, and then using the butterfly stencil. And then this one, I actually layered 2 stencils. So I have this heart. It looks like this, and I want that to also kind of look the same. So what I can do is basically load this stamp back up. And now I'm going to basically stamp onto there to pick up some of that ink, and then stamp it on my project. Let's do it on camera. How about? And now I have a smaller heart that has that pattern. And this stamp that I just did, if I stamp this off, it might show, it might not, because I don't know if I got all the ink, but it should have a lighter, see how that's got that lighter heart in the middle? So that's another whole different design that I could create as well. So this is called kissing technique, where you basically stick 2 stamps together, one's pattern, one's solid, and you can create any kind of design on your stamp that you want. All right, now I can take my big stamp and create my 3rd. Another technique you can use to create another interesting design, and I'm going to use it with, let's see, I'll try it with these guys. Now I talked about how to load the stamp by tapping, twisting, tapping. So I'm going to load the stamp like that, but then at the end I'm going to kind of swipe it, and depending on what kind of ink pad it is, it'll give you different effects. But now when I stamp, it might actually have a directional pattern right on the stamp. So see how that has that kind of swipey effect, which is really cool. The other thing you can do, especially when you have these shadow type stamps that have a lot of area on them, is you can go in and you can remove some of the pigment. So let's say I wanted this to have polka dots. You can just remove some of that ink. And now I have a whole different stamp. So one stamp can be so many different things, as you can see. Now I can also, with this one stamp, decide, well, what if I wanted my hearts to be different colors? What if I didn't want them all to be the same thing? You can do an ombre effect with multiple ink pads. Let's say I'll use these 3. I can do it this way, where I just use these smaller pads, work better for this. And like for the middle one, I'll really need a smaller pad. So I'm just going to load this middle one with this color. If using a big pad, I can do the edge easy enough, but it's really hard for me to focus just on the inside. And then I can, actually, I'm going to do it this way. You can either load from the top You can either load from the stamp or you can load from the pad. It depends on what you're trying to do. Now this one, I want to see where I'm loading it, and it's a clear stamp, so it's easier for me to load this way. They actually make ink pads that have multiple colors right on them. So I can get different colors just by doing that. Another way that I can get different colors or create more details is by using the markers. And I told you guys that I'd be showing you how to use these markers to create stamping with. So these are the Stampin' Up markers. So Stampin' Up also has the re-inkers. I can use these for different techniques as well. They have the stamp pads, which I've used before, and they have these markers. And so they're all coordinating colors. So I have these 3 colors in all those 3 different formulas. So I can just color right on my stamp. Now I use the brush side and I lay it on its side. I don't poke it down this way because you don't want to damage that brush tip. But it doesn't work well if you have a fine tipped side of the marker. It can work with chisel tip, or the brush tip works best. And this is great if you're doing like flowers, where maybe you want the stems to be green and you want the flowers to be red. You're going to have a hard time getting that detail. So this technique is great for that kind of thing. I want to make sure I get nice and juicy on there. Okay, now as I've been working, it's maybe dried a little bit. I'm trying to get a little bit of yellow right in the middle there. It's maybe dried up a little bit, so I can just huff on it with my breath. That might sound weird, but it just gives a little bit of moisture to it so that you can stamp it, keep it activated if it's taken a time for you to do the drawing. And then you can basically get your customized, whatever you're looking for. Now, would work better on the rubber stamp because, again, that ink doesn't do great on these photopolymers for some reason. So let's just do an example on this. It'll be a little bit better. And you can see I can basically customize it as much as I want. So that's a great way to use the markers to get exactly what you're looking for. Now, I showed you last time these layered stamps, and I did want to demonstrate putting these together. So if you have one of these kits that are layered, they're designed to work together. And this is a great way to use the Misty. Great time to pull that out. Okay, I'm going to just put this right in that corner. Exactly where I want it to be. All right, so it's got these 3 different stamps that are all designed to layer on top of each other, and then it has a stem. So you want to usually start with the shadow stamp. That's the one that has the most coverage, the solid stamp. All right, I have my stem. Now it's sticking to the paper too because it's kind of gummy. So now this is when it's really important for me to put this back in position. I want it right in that corner. And I know if I get it right back in that corner, it's going to, that's why these magnets are helpful, but I can just make sure it's in that corner and it's fine because the magnet wasn't enough to resist the stickiness of this stamp. So that's okay. All right. So for this first color, I'm going to go with my lighter shade. I'm going to use this light green. I'm using this pigment ink. And I'm going to look to see if that looks good, and it looks good. So I don't have to stamp that again. Always want to check before you take the stamp off, because once you take the stamp off, you've lost your positioning edge. I'm going to go ahead and put my other solid stamp down. These are actually Stampin' Up brand, so that these ones might work better with Stampin' Up. They feel a little tackier. Okay. It's definitely sticking to my paper. So that happens, that's why it's important to have that quarter. All right, now I'm going to use the light color with this. You could use 3 tones of the same color, 3 values of the same color, or whatever you want. But as long as they look good together, you don't want to have them, because it is going to be transparent. So if you lay down complementary colors, they would gray each other out. So you do want to use colors that are analogous or next to each other on the color wheel for this type. Or you can use, black as one of the colors, but just make sure that the colors are going to work together. So there's my base of the flower. I just have these colors out, so I'm using them. Okay, so now I'm using the second layer. It's a little bit more detail. And again, it's wanting to lift up the paper. This magnet isn't powerful enough for the tackiness of it, but all right, now I'm going to use my mid value. And you can see it's showing more of that detail. It's turning it green because, of course, it's sort of blue-green on top of yellow, so it's going to be like just a more yellowy green. Probably wouldn't be the color palette I would choose for a flower, but it's fine for the demonstration. Okay, and now I'm going with my darkest value. And it actually has these tabs to kind of help you line them up, but I'm just eyeballing it. You could also do black on this layer if you wanted it to be more of a line and wash look. All right, I've got that detail, and then I'm going to do the final detail of the stem. I might have to do this one on a block because it just lays on its side. That's okay. I can kind of see, I can see through it pretty well anyway. So I'm just going to do this on a block because it doesn't stay upright. And then I'm going to do this the darkest color as well. And this is why, an example of why you have to be careful not to rock and roll. Because I had such a skinny thing on here, I rocked the acrylic block a little bit too much, and it had ink on the corner. So you can do a couple of things. I mean, this is just too big of a block for this, so it's just easy to tilt, but you can also just wipe off any excess ink that you get on the edges to make sure that that doesn't happen. So that's basically how you would do layered stamps. You just do one layer at a time, and you can get a lot of fun effects by doing that. Hello, excuse me. Just a little bit of a reminder for you to please like, subscribe, share, comment, interact with my videos just to help get me noticed on YouTube if you find this content helpful. All right, let's get back to the program. Thanks. And then if you don't have a layered stamp that's designed to be a layered stamp, you can create a layered stamp, and I'll show you how to do that. It works best if you have something that is more symmetrical side to side, and that is kind of a detail type stamp. So I'm going to do it with this since I've been using this. It won't be perfect, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It's supposed to be kind of loose and painterly. Basically, what I can do is I can put the stamp down backwards. Now, sometimes it'll stick to the acrylic and sometimes it won't. If it's tacky enough, it will. This one is, so it did stick to it. So basically, this is the back of the stamp that I'm going to now put some pigment on. So it's going to be just a solid, like a shadow or like a matte of the shape. This is not exactly a symmetrical heart. This little loop is a little bit smaller, so it may be a little off, but that's okay. It's close enough. And now I have a really cool matting or shadow stamp, first layer stamp. And now I can lay this down where the actual stamp pattern is on the correct side. It's hard to tell in the video, but I'm just putting the design down this time. All right, so there, now I have that foreground of the stamp and then the background of the stamp. So I just basically created a layered stamp out of one stamp. And if you just want the shadow part, you could just do that too. Let's say I just want to create kind of a watermark effect. There are a few different ways that you can do that, and that's just basically subtle tone on tone. So I'm going to take a similar shade. I don't know if this is going to be dark enough, but we'll give it a try. So just using just a darker shade of whatever paper that you're using, and you can, this might be too dark. Yeah, let me do the lighter one. See how this one's a little bit lighter. Yeah, so it's going to just be a little bit more subtle. So if you're making, again, more of that background paper, you could just do some echo effect where you stamp and then you stamp again. You just do several generations and you get different, a gradient of pigment saturation, and that looks pretty cool. If you had too dark of ink, what you could do is you could stamp off once and stamp on, and then you get a more subtle look. Another way that you can get it, and I'll be talking more about the embossing ink later, but you can do the same thing, but just using the embossing ink, because the embossing ink is, like I said, it's got that glycerin, so it kind of gives the paper a little bit of a wet look. And in theory, when it dries, it should also continue to be a little bit darker than the original color. So you can get just a really subtle watermark effect by using that. Now, this glycerin-based, the pigment inks, the glycerin-based embossing pad, all of those are in this, the glycerin-based. You would heat set them just to make sure that they're more permanent. And they take a long time to dry. And we'll be using them for heat embossing next month. But you can kind of see that, well, I don't know if you can see in that camera, but they're kind of shiny on the page because they're definitely wet, whereas this absorbs right into the paper. Now, another way that you can get this effect is to stamp on a white paper. So I'm going to use the emboss ink again. Now you can do this with also the embossing powder too. You can create a resist effect, but and that's basically what this is. It's kind of a resist because that glycerin will act as a bit of a resist against the pigment that I add on top of it. So what it's going to do is it's going to keep the white of the paper underneath. And in order to do that, I have to dry this first. So give me just a second to heat set it. I'll show you what happens if I don't dry it. It's kind of an opposite effect. So this time I dried it. Hopefully it's completely dry. Now I'm just going to take a blending brush, and I'm going to take a little bit of some whatever color. I'm going to use the Distress ink, and I'm just going to blend that on there. And in theory, hopefully it works when I demonstrate it. It's very subtle, so I'm hoping it'll pick up on the camera. but it just basically resists that pigment from getting into absorbing into the paper. So can you guys, it's a little bit tricky to see. Let me see if I can, there we go. See how you can kind of see that stamp. It's a very subtle effect. And of course, the bigger the design is, the more obvious it's going to be. Now, what if I did that same thing, but I did not heat set it? Okay, so if I stamp this on the white and I don't do any heat setting, I just leave it wet, and then I go in with my pigment again. It acts more like a binder. So it's going to bind the pigment from my dye ink and create a reverse effect where it's actually going to darken in those areas that have that pigment ink. So this one, it keeps it lighter where the pigment ink was, and this one, it actually makes it darker. So you get a tone on tone effect by doing it that way. So you can get those two different effects with that embossing. So this embossing ink is pretty fun. It has a lot of different things you can do. Next month, we're going to be doing more with it. So it's a nice option to have in your toolbox of inking or embossing. If you're doing either of those, I would recommend having some. All right, let's see. Now, you might also want to have a reflection of a stamp. So let's say I want to create Hello Love, and I want it to look like it's sitting on a pool of water and there's a reflection. So how do I make that happen? And you might, off the top of your head, go, well, all you have to do is rotate it and stamp it, but that's not correct, because if I do that, if I stamp it, and then I want a reflection of it, and I turn it around, that's not a reflection of it. So I go, okay, well, how do I make a reflection of that? Well, what you have to do is you have to stamp it and then stamp it back again. So basically you have to transfer it to a material and then transfer it back in the correct orientation. So I basically rolled this on top of the stamp. So I transferred that to here. Now I have to see where I'm going to be placing it because I want it to be right on the bottom of that. So then I get a reflection. And then I could go in, if I wanted, I could create my little water line. I'm masking off the top parts. And then I'm going to create my little water line below. There, and now you have a little reflection in the water. Now I'm, of course, doing this more quickly, but you get the idea. If you don't have a braid roller, but you have a big rubber stamp that's just plain, like if I had a solid, like a solid heart or something like that, I have this sheet of rubber, so this would work where I could just stamp it off on here. The trick of it, of course, is going to be stamping it back on the correct location. Make sure I'm lining it up. I mean, that's the tricky part. I've already got it on there, so I'm not going to do that again. But and then you just lay it down. Now, it might be easier to do the reverse first. I'm going to use my sprayer to make sure that it's picking it up. Okay, so now I have the reverse, and now it might be easier to just do the stamp because I can see the stamp a lot easier. And that might be the way to do it, is just get your placement of your reflection and then come back and do your main one afterwards. So that might be one option you can do. I think it's a little bit easier. And then to make it really reflective, like if you're using a water activatable ink, you could then wet that and kind of move that pigment a little bit. Now this is the pigment ink, so it doesn't move quite as easy. I don't think. I can try to see if I can get it to move a little bit. It might move. I wonder if it would move. Well, we'll see. I'm going to go just try a little bit of water. Maybe if I did it sooner, but you can, try to, oh, see, it's moving. You can try to move that reflection a little bit. This one probably won't move because I already left it too long. After it sits for a long time, the pigments to become more water resistant. So that is a way that you can basically create a reflection with any, non-symmetrical shape that you want. I want to do watercolor effects. And for those, I'm going to use some watercolor paper. Now, some of these effects you can use regular cardstock. It depends on the cardstock, but it may not come out as well if you do. So just be aware that it could work, but it may not be as effective. And I do want to do this with a water activatable ink. I think you could try some of them with the pigment inks, but I don't know that they're going to work as well. So I would probably stick to something that is more, that is more activatable. So I have my turtle. Now the first thing that I could do is I could just stamp the image on here with a permanent ink, and I could basically watercolor it. Now, because this is waterproof, it's not gonna smudge and smear when I do my watercolor techniques. In order to do my watercolor techniques, just like with watercolor, and I can do this with any of my water activatable inks. So I'm going to use my Stampin' Up. Let's say I just have Crayola markers and I don't even have ink pads. That's okay. You can use it with your markers. Just put your markers on any plastic surface or any, non-porous surface. Just put your colors down. And then either with the, I actually like just a paintbrush. You can use one of those water pens, but honestly, some of my water pens have been really leaking a lot, and I've had a lot of problems with water control with those lately. So I'm actually starting to prefer just to use just watercolor brushes. And I can just basically now color my artwork. I have a little thing of water here in a little cap. So I can either do it like this with the markers, but if I do have my ink pads, the cool thing about the Stampin' Up, and again, I used to be a Stampin' Up demonstrator, so that's why I know all these things, but you can squeeze the pigment, you can kind of squeeze the box and the pigment will go right on the top. And then you can use that as a little water pellet. All right, so you can make some really cool effects by just watercoloring your image. And then in order to, if I wanted to fussy cut that out, fussy cutting is just basically cutting around the shape. I do like these scissors, which are spring activated. And so you can really get some detail and get right along the edge. And what I do is I try to get as close as I can, and then I'll basically cover the edges with black ink just to sort of clean up the edges a little bit if there's some white around it that I don't want. And then that's a way that you can create a fussy cut. Okay, that's one watercolor technique. Number two, wet on wet, just like in watercolor. If you follow my watercolor, you can just start off with a wet page. Now I'm going to take my stamp and I'm going to go into my water activatable ink, and I can load it up with different colors. It's better to go from light to dark. Okay, and then I'm going to just stamp it on there. And then you'll notice that that image is already starting to bleed. See, it's already starting to bleed out. So you get a nice loose painterly design where it was wet here. Clearly the paper was a little dry, but never fear. If I don't like that, if it's not bleeding enough, I can always spritz it afterwards too. So that's the next one. I'm going to let that go and let it do its thing. And I'll come back to that in a second. Now, this time I'm not going to wet the paper first. I'm going to just go ahead and I'll just use one color. So it's dry paper. So this is wet on dry. And then I'm going to wet it. And you can see what starts happening once I wet it. So if I had different colors, they would start mixing and blending together. So I'm going to put that aside. Now I'm going to start with dry paper again. This time I'm going to load my stamp, and then I'm spritzing. I'm going to get the paper out of the way because I don't want the paper wet. I'm spritzing my stamp, and then I'm going to stamp. And it gives soft colors, but not quite as flowing as the ones where I sprayed it. See how much those are moving? The other thing you can do is stamp it on the dry. Get this out of the way. And then while it's still wet, you can go in with your paintbrush and just move the pigment around wherever you want. Maybe you want some shadows over here. Soften some shadow lines. So you just can soften it up a little bit. Or I could add some more other colors. Maybe I just didn't get, maybe I wanted more colors in. So I can kind of do a combo, either just moving the ink around that I already stamped on there, or I can add more. So let's look and see how these other watercolor effects are doing. Look at that. That's really moving. This one, you can hardly tell, you know, what it was. And this one's fairly clear, just a little soft edges, not a lot of movement there. Now, what I can do is if I really lose my image and I'm not happy with that, I could go back in once it's dry, or even while it's drying. It doesn't have to be perfectly aligned, but I can just stamp right over the top of that. And if it's still a little bit wet, it'll bleed out a little bit, but if it's not, it'll stay pretty solid. And if I do want softer looks, I can always go in with my brush and I can soften. It's like, okay, I really wanted it to kind of bleed out a little bit, or, you know, soften certain areas. I can just go in and soften those. Same with this one. I kind of lost a chunk of that. So maybe I want to go in, and you can even go in if you want with black on top of it, and you can even emboss it. I mean, you can really go any direction that you want. Maybe I wanted a little off center to make a little shadow effect. That's kind of fun looking. You can play around definitely with watercolor. I mean, all the effects that you can do with watercolor, you can pretty much do with inks too. They're a very similar medium, just in a different formula. If you don't like the fact that it's on the stamp pad, I mean, these are essentially, you know, liquid So all you'd have to do is drip it into onto your palette, and now you have very much like watercolor liquid, and you can do some really deep painting effects with it. Another effect that you can do if you load your paper. Now I could really make my own pigmented cardstock from my ink, especially with the Stampin' Up ink pads, because they're nice big, they're kind of big and they're juicier, you know, than some. A lot of the dye inks have that linen felt base, and so they're kind of hard. So it's hard to really get a lot of pigment to come up, and this one's that firm foam. So this really releases a lot of ink when you want. So I can really load up the paper, and I could just make my own solid cardstock. But I can also do some fun effects with just some water. So let's say I want to create some, and I'm going to probably do this with, maybe I'll do this with a big wipe, because you can spritz, but I'm trying to do little sections. I think it's a little different with the big wipe, because big wipe might have a little alcohol in it, but I'm just going to put, I'm going to make this real wet. Hopefully I just spritz that. And I'm just going to go in this corner, and I'm just going to dab over the top of the stencil, and it'll lift some of that pigment where it's open in the stencil. And after it dries, it'll be even more obvious. The other thing that you can do is basically wet your stamp with water. The other thing I could do is just spritz it or splatter with my fingers, and that's going to activate that pigment and it'll lift it up. Now, sometimes what I'll do is I'll just dab it with a cloth, and that'll even pull more of that pigment off. Actually, this is watercolor paper, and I did that technique before on regular paper. So maybe I'll just try it on regular paper. I think it maybe works better on that. That might be the problem. This was a wet corner, and it's really like soaking into that wet corner. It's interesting. And this is why you get re-inkers, because if you do a lot of this type of technique, you can use up a lot of ink very quickly. All right, so I'm going to do the water technique again. And then the other one I wanted to show you is with bleach. Be careful with this, obviously, for many reasons, you know. But how I would do it is I just have this little old piece of cotton in this tray. You could use just some paper towel or whatever you want. And I'm just wetting it with some bleach because I want to make, basically I'm making a makeshift stamp pad. And, you know, do this in a well-ventilated area. Some people even spray this, but I don't know that I would want to spray, have aerosolized bleach. This is bad enough, smelly enough. But I can take my stamp. Now you can already see that water is starting to lift. It's very subtle. And I'm going to load my stamp with some bleach. It's already lifting. So that's lifting, and you get kind of, you know, more chemical reactions. So the color that you get might vary depending on what color you're working with. This is on an inked color, but I could also try it on just a colored cardstock. So let's see what that looks like. So if I didn't have any ink to work with, and I only had a handful of stamps, maybe I have acrylic paints, because you could also do acrylic paints act more like the pigment inks, and watercolor paints act more like the dye inks. So you can always think about your things that you do with your acrylics or your watercolor, and try those techniques with your inks. And then let's just try it with black as well. I just recycled an old makeup bottle and I put bleach in there. So it's just an eyedropper, so I can really have it controlled. And, you know, always test things out before you do them on the project. One good rule of thumb, because things don't always work. Like so far, that's not lifting, but it does take a while sometimes for that bleach. This one's really cool. I like that yellow effect. Another way to get this kind of effect, it's almost like that bokeh effect. I could also create that similar effect with using white pigment ink. You get several different effects, and you can use all three together. Now, obviously, if you're using bleach, I'm not going to say that has any kind of archival quality to it. I wouldn't count on that, but this is just for a card, for fun. It's not a big deal for your art journal. This one is still cooking. Let me see if I can, I'm going to go ahead and dry it and see if I can get it to activate a little quicker. Yeah, that one didn't really turn out that great. I thought the black would. It didn't really work too well. And I don't know if that's because I didn't get enough bleach on it. Maybe working through that stencil just wasn't juicy enough. Let me try it this way by stamping. See if that does anything. Oh yeah, that's working much better. So I think it's just that I didn't get enough bleach going through that stencil, but clearly, I mean, I'm getting it right away with that. All right, I gotta stop at some point, right? So we've covered a lot of fun things. Hopefully I've given you some more tools in your toolbox of stamping. And again, just think about if you're into painting, think about things you do there. You can always apply that here. Next week, I'm going to be adding more things. So we're going to be talking about alcohol, and I'm going to talk more about the white, some other specialty kind of things. And in this video, I'm going to continue our inky journal, our inky journey with more stamping techniques. We're going to be doing some watercolor. Okay, let's start over. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Healing Art After. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Healing Art After Hours. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, etc. if you find my content helpful. And as always, happy creating. Thank you. Bye.